Here is a common beginner airbrush setup. A generic airbrush compressor with an air tank, and this cheap airbrush from Amazon. To operate the compressor, plug in the power cable and switch it on at the back. You'll have airflow coming out the front hose connector. At the bottom of the air tank there's a small valve that can be opened or closed by unscrewing it. This is used to drain the tank of any fluid buildup, something I recommend doing every so often. If the tank has fluid buildup, it can lead to the inside becoming rusted and the tank may burst, which is exactly what happened here. This is my old compressor which I had for about 5 years and it was really reliable. But I didn't empty the tank and it burst at the back. I highly recommend not resealing or fixing the hole, as you can't be sure how much of the tank has rusted away, and fixing it may result in a second more violent burst. The best thing to do is just keep an eye on it and empty the tank every so often. I'll be using my Sparmax TC610H, which is a higher quality version of the first compressor, but honestly I didn't notice much difference when I changed over. Screw on the hose whilst the compressor is off and then connect it to the airbrush. Once both connections are tight, turn on the compressor at the switch. The pressure should start rising as the tank is being filled with air. Once it's reached the selected pressure, the compressor will automatically turn off. As soon as the stored air pressure drops below the set pressure, it will start running again. To change the pressure that the air is expelled at, hold down on the airbrush trigger and lift and twist the regulator knob. You'll see the needle on the gauge move. Stop twisting at the desired pressure and release the trigger. The pressure will be set. The needle may rise, but as soon as you press the trigger, the needle will drop back to the set pressure. Also, on the PSI regulator, there is a small water collector that will need to be emptied when you see it collecting fluid. That's done by pressing the valve up and using a towel to catch the water. Here we have a selection of tools and products that I use for airbrushing. This is the TimberTech airbrush, which costs £20.95 on Amazon, and is what I'll be using for the course build. These are the paints and thinners that I'll be using. I've narrowed it down to 2 different paints for airbrushing. Tamiya acrylics, which need to be thinned, and Mr. paints, which can be airbrushed straight from the bottle. I've had a great time using both, and I think they're a good starting point for a beginner. To thin the Tamiya acrylics, the recommended thinner is Tamiya X20A. It's always a good idea to keep things in-house, so for example, if you're using a Tamiya paint, use a Tamiya thinner. However, I can also recommend this Mr. Colour leveling thinner to be used with Tamiya paints too. This gives you a slightly better surface finish. But mainly I'll be using that thinner for the primer, which you'll see later on in the course. For mixing paints, I like to use these plastic shot cups, which can be bought in bulk from places like Amazon. They can also be washed out and reused. I use these 3mm pipettes to measure paint for thinning ratios, and they're also useful to move the paint to the airbrush. Next, I have some brushes. I use these to clean the airbrush and stir paints in the colour cup. The green brush is a Humbrol Coloro size 8, which does the job nicely. You can also find these stiff bristle brushes in airbrush cleaning packs, which are good for scrubbing the airbrush during a deep clean. To clean the airbrush, I use Mr. Colour Thinner. This isn't specifically an airbrush cleaner, but over the years I've found it does a better job than most of the cleaners I've tried. It's a paint thinner, but it can tackle any paint, wet or dry, that you throw at it. So if you're struggling to clean the airbrush, I suggest giving this a go. I also like to pour some into these mini dropper bottles, which again can be bought from Amazon. Another must-have tool is an airbrush cleaning pot, which also acts as a stand. You can spray the excess paint and cleaner into the pot and the gas will come out through this hole with a filter in it. I suggest pointing the hole in the direction of your extraction system. For me, I have a big fan and tube just off the camera to the left. I hold the pot into the fan and all the fumes go out the window. A great system to start with is using these enclosed spray booths. Whilst airbrushing, you need to wear a paint mask. I've had this mask for a while, but I regularly change the filters. Most paints are harmful when atomized, so it's better to be protected than destroy your lungs. Mr. paints are very potent, so you definitely need an extraction system and a paint mask. Airbrushing does require some setup in order to do it safely and correctly. Lastly, here's the iWater cleaning kit. I picked this up a long time ago, but I've only used a handful of things from it. We'll come back to the cleaning at the end. Now let's have a go at painting. So let's thin our Tamiya paint. For this demo I'm using XF82 Ocean Grey. I'll be mixing it 50-50 with X20A. 50-50 is a good starting point for Tamiya, and most of the time it works fine. When we mix the paints, we need to think about how much we're going to actually need to paint the area. I find when airbrushing you need less than you think. I'm going to use 1 ml of paint and 1 ml of thinner. This should be plenty to cover the wing of this paint mule. Using spare kits is a great way to practice. You get used to holding a model and working around different shapes. This is an Airfix 172 Defiant, which I decided would be better to use as a test bed for different techniques and designs. For now, I'll be using the right wing as a demo surface. Once the paint is mixed, we can lay down a piece of kitchen paper to protect our surface. I'll be airbrushing at 15 to 20 psi, and for this demo I set my compressor to 17 psi. This is a good pressure range, but you can experiment. To operate the airbrush, push down on the trigger to release air, and then pull back on the trigger to release paint. The further you pull back, the more paint comes out. Because of the shape of the needle, the paint flow with a small pull will cover a small area with little paint, and with the trigger pulled further back, it will cover a larger area with more paint. Practice doing lines going from thin to wide and back again. Get used to the feel of the trigger and aiming the airbrush. By bringing the nozzle of the airbrush close to the surface and pulling back very slightly on the trigger, we can get some very crisp thin lines. Now we can apply a base coat to the wing. Apply the paint in a sweeping motion, changing direction and laying down a uniform layer as best you can. We want to apply a controlled amount of paint. If we pull back too much on the trigger whilst the nozzle is close, we'll get a puddle of paint on the surface. The distance of the nozzle from the surface will determine how far you can pull back the trigger without flooding the surface. Practice finding the sweet spot between the two. For areas on the model that have tight corners, like the wing root, it's best to do light coats to avoid too much paint building up. Now we can finish off the wing with another layer to get that uniform colour. Once we finish painting the grey, we need to wash out the colour cup. When switching between colours, we only need to wash out the remaining paint, and then we can flush out the excess with cleaner. I start with a few drops of cleaner to dilute the remaining paint and spray it out. Then I add another few drops to wash the colour cup. Place your finger on the nozzle and pull back on the trigger, which puts air into the colour cup and mixes the liquid. This is called back flushing. Then finally, I'll add a couple of drops to do a check of cleanliness by back flushing and seeing if it stays clear. Repeat the process until there's no lingering colour from the previous paint. If you want to quickly switch between colours, you can shorten the process and just spray out the previous paint followed by some cleaner. However, after a while, some of the paint will dry in the colour cup and on the needle. This will cause blocking. You'll notice the paint flow begin to spit or become intermittent. This is likely because the paint has dried on the needle and it's preventing the wet paint from coming through. Rinsing out the colour cup as I showed you will solve this. You can also use a soft brush to wipe the tip of the needle and nozzle cap. We don't have to disassemble the airbrush until we've finished all the painting. Now let's use the Mr. Paint colour. I've gone for MRP 110 dark green as this is the colour I'll be using for the course build. This paint can be airbrushed directly from the bottle. Make sure you wear your paint mask when using Mr. Paints as they're very potent. Give it a good shake until you can see that it's well mixed. Then drop some paint into the colour cup and test the flow. Again, practicing different spraying techniques. Lay down a uniform layer to get a feel for how the paint flows. MRP are slightly thinner in consistency than our previous paint mixture, so it will take a few more coats to get a uniform finish. Some of the MRP colours will dry with a gloss finish, but that's not a bad thing because it means the surface is smooth. Now if you want to, you can practice using the airbrush to outline a camouflage pattern on the previous layer of grey. This is a hard technique to master, and in the course I'll be teaching you a far easier way to achieve this pattern. But this is a good airbrushing exercise to practice with. Once you're finished, we can wash out the colour cup in the same way. By the time you've washed out the airbrush, the paint will be dry and safe to handle. We can see that the mixture of 50/50 Tamiya paint to thinner has given us a nice smooth finish, and the MRP has done the same, but with half of the work. Both of these paints are excellent and my personal favourites. I highly recommend starting with these, and you should have an easy time achieving a great result. Now let's give the airbrush a deep clean. If you don't clean out the airbrush, any paint left over will solidify inside and be difficult to remove. There are lots of different tools you can get, as well as large cleaning kits like this. But out of all these things, this group of tools is what I find the most useful. So starting with our brushes, as discussed earlier, we have these to wash out the colour cup, and we can use them to wash other parts too. Soak them in cleaner and then brush the parts clean. Then we have this unique tool, which is basically just a large needle used to scrape paint out of the nozzle. It also has a tool on the end which is used to remove the nozzle, which we also find here. Next, we have a magnifying glass to check the needle tip and anything else you need a closer look at. If the tip of the needle is bent, it may affect paint flow, so having that is really useful to check the tip. This is lubricant which can be used on the trigger to maintain its responsiveness. Here is a bunch of cleaning rods with different sized bristles. These can be used generally over any areas, but are most useful at cleaning out the colour cup feed hole. And finally, we have Mr. Colour Thinner in a dropper bottle as our cleaner. Before we disassemble the airbrush, we need to turn off the compressor and let the air out by pressing down on the trigger. Once it's depressurized, we can unscrew the hose. Now we can take it apart, starting at the handle. Then remove the needle chucking guide nut. This allows us to move the needle freely. In my opinion, it's best to take the needle out, pulling it out from the front. That way any paint on the needle doesn't get dragged back into the housing, but it doesn't really make that much difference. To allow us to take the needle out the front, we need to unscrew the nozzle cap and the nozzle using one of our tools. This is a tiny piece, so don't lose it. Now you can push from the back and remove the needle. Once the needle's out, the trigger is free to move. The needle holds the trigger in by going through this gap. Lastly, we can remove the spring guide and needle chucking guide. You can also remove the air hose connector at the bottom, but this doesn't need cleaning and will usually be coated in grease, so we want to leave that as is. But you can see where the trigger connects. Now we have a fully disassembled airbrush. I start by putting cleaner on the paper towel and then sandwiching the needle and pulling it back through. Add a twisting motion to further scrub the paint off. We can see after 3 swipes there's no more paint coming off. Now we can check the tip under the magnifier, checking for any bends. For the needle chucking guide, this shouldn't collect any paint, but you can run the cleaning rods through and use a damp brush to clean it if you want. Usually just a quick look through the hole will show you whether it's clean or not. The trigger just needs to be wiped however you see fit. Then if you hadn't already, you can clean out the colour cup. Now we can use the cleaning rods to go back through the hole at the front. The brush works well here too. If you have any stubborn paint, you can use the needle tool to scrape it out. And now in the nozzle too. You don't want to apply heavy pressure, just enough to scrape out the paint. Once that's done, you can put it back on, finger tight. For the nozzle cap, we can use any tools to clean it up. Before we put the trigger back in, it's good to add a small drop of lubricant to the bottom. This will spread out once it's reinstalled. Now we can add the next few parts. To get the needle back in, I guide it with my fingertip. You want to very gently push it back in until the thicker part of the needle is fully in, then you can be a bit more forceful pushing it through. This is the most common place to break the needle tip, so take your time. Add the chucking guide nut and handle and you're good to go. Lastly, we can wash it through with some thinner. I tend to pour it back out the first time, as we don't want to send any small lumps of paint left over into the nozzle. And that's it. That was a basic breakdown of the airbrush from setup to cleanup. There's far more to airbrushing than just what we discussed, but I wanted to make it simple and understandable for a beginner. And now you're ready to start the course.